Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stress Free IEP, the show where we help families build their village to raise their neurodivergent children with confidence and support. I'm your host, Frances Schefter, special education attorney, advocate, and fellow parent walking this journey with you. Each week, we shine a light on the professionals, resources, and real world strategies that can empower you to navigate the IEP process and beyond without stress. Whether you're tuning in live on Facebook or YouTube or listening later on your favorite podcast app, we are so glad you're here. Let's dive in and meet today's amazing guest. Dr. Carey Heller is a licensed psychologist and the co-founder of Heller Psychology Group, specializing in ADHD and executive functioning challenges in children, adolescents, and adults. He provides psychotherapy, ADHD executive functioning coaching, and psychoeducational testing for ADHD, learning disabilities, and related items. Dr. Heller also runs an executive functioning boot camp program. In addition to Dr. Heller's work with his practice, he volunteers his time in a variety of ways. Specifically, he serves as the Montgomery County, Maryland CHAD chapter coordinator and is on the National CHAD Board. He also supervises graduate students conducting testing at the George Washington University. Furthermore, Dr. Heller serves as president of WISER, a group of professionals in the DMV who work with kids and teens around education. And finally, he loves to write, has published a few books and numerous articles, especially in Attention Magazine and Washington Parent Magazine. Carey, welcome to the show. And I have to say, I've known you for how long, and I didn't realize you published some books. So,
it's been a long time, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, let's jump in on I know you specialize mostly in ADHD. And I know, surprisingly, I still get a question often, like executive functioning. What is executive functioning?
Well, I mean, it's a good question because you hear the term a lot, but people don't always take the time to step back and define it. Basically, I mean, it's a set of mental processes that are used to essentially, you need the skill sets basically in order to really complete a task. So it's an umbrella term that really encompasses planning, organizing, task initiation, so like getting going with things. So if you're going to, let's say a child, they're going to complete a homework assignment. So they need to be able to think about identify what assignment do they have, then to make a plan. So the planning piece, breaking it down into parts. So, sort of sequencing, dividing up a task into parts, and then holding that information in their mind of here are the task instructions. Here's what I need to do. And then to be able to stick with that to be able to follow through and complete the task. So it's a lot of skill sets put together. And, ADHD certainly, I mean, the way that I conceptualize it, if you look at the definition, by default, if you have ADHD, because of the criteria used to define it, you have weaknesses in executive functioning. But anxiety, depression, OCD, I mean, pretty much, I think any mental health disorder can, cause impairments in executive functioning. Because with anxiety, it impacts trouble focusing, and then you may have a harder time with planning, keeping organized, same thing with depression. So it's, but even things like lack of sleep can impact executive functioning. It's almost anything can impact it. Because basically, think about it is, if you're having a hard time with executive functioning, you're not functioning optimally.
Right. And that makes sense. I mean, I'm thinking about lack of sleep, overly stressed, and all of that. But it's harder for those with ADHD and other neurodiversities because even if they have full sleep and functioning, on everything that they need, food, the basics, they're still going to have a difficult time with executive functioning. What's one of the biggest challenges you see with kids in the schools?
I would say one of the things I see is that a lot of the challenges involve the planning and the organizing of assignments, and I find that that's an issue that because a lot of it occurs at home. I think sometimes it's harder to have accommodations that always fully support that I still think there's a lot that needs to be done at home that, an accommodation can only go so far. And, there's certainly things teachers can do to help with it, but, there's still a big ownership on the part of the person themselves to navigate that piece of it.
Right. And that makes sense because if It always makes me crazy because they're given extra time. So great. If you don't finish it in school, now you get to go home and do it. But if you have executive functioning, like, okay, now how do I balance that with all of my extracurricular stuff and make it all work?
Right. And, that's a challenge. That's, one of the things that, because I do testing as part of the practice. And so with recommendations, extended time on assignments is not something I recommend that much. Or if I do in a very like controlled way, because I've definitely seen it snowball very easily where if someone has extended time for assignments, it can then lead to, the class has moved on to something else and now they have, double the work and then they fall behind further. So I think, it has to be used in a very sort of controlled and like planned way. So I think that having a clear sense also when is the actual deadline if you have extended time is important, because I've seen that too quite a bit where, you just take extra time. And I've seen this even at the college level too. But the problem is if there's no firm deadline, it makes it much harder to keep track of when to get it done by, or even was it turned in on time.
Right. Exactly. Or you end up, because like Montgomery County made a new rule that everything had to be turned in 5 days before the end of the semester. So this last Friday was the last day. So my daughter decided she cared about her grades and wanted to make up all her assignments on Thursday night. So we were up late doing it because, she missed some days and she has extended time and that's what happens. And, I'm very, mental health is more important. Let's, your grades are fine as long as you're passing everything. But then she decided she cared and, so we're going to do it all now. Okay, let's do it all. As a parent, what else are you going to do? Right. No matter how much we try to space it out. But that happens, but it's overwhelming for some kids because, now what? Like, okay, they've missed 2 weeks of school, plus they have extended time. And now you have a semester's worth of stuff that you're behind on and you have to do it all. Which is why
even without the extended time part, if they're trying to make up assignments while I can start to turn them in, that can be very overwhelming trying to get the, stay on top of the current stuff and find enough time to be able to get all of the late stuff done and figure out how to even prioritize that.
Right. And that's sometimes why I get put on IEPs, the reduction in workload to just prove mastery. So, like everybody else has to do 20 assignments, but in reality, only 10 matter. So they only have to do 10, which then at least makes it a little more manageable, right?
Right.
But, so what, I know, I hear everybody all the time. Okay, so executive functioning, keeping organized, doing this, doing that. So for all ADHD kids, they should be using an organizer. We should do a task analysis checklist and this, and these accommodations, the extra time and so forth. Does that work for all ADHD kids?
Good question. Generally, it doesn't. I mean, my approach is that, one size does not fit all in terms of accommodations. And even just aside from formal accommodations, even what you want to, someone to do themselves to help ADHD. Because the problem is, like from an accommodations perspective, it's not just about, it's not just about having a diagnosis of ADHD or whatever the diagnosis is. It's about the functional impact on academic functioning. And so we want to look at for each person is what, if someone has ADHD, for that individual person, what are sort of challenges caused by the ADHD that are leading to the issues in school, and use that to then work backwards to figure out what accommodations make sense. And so that's why they may vary some. I mean, extended time probably is among the more common, if not the most common accommodation for not just ADHD, but for a lot of other issues. But what's interesting about it is, like, one of the things that I see quite a bit is, there's certainly a fair amount of times where someone also has low processing speed with ADHD. And so then the extended time may make sense because of that. One of the other areas where I see it, helpful in a lot of ways is with lapses in attention. So if someone has a hard time focusing, which, usually given ADHD is quite common, that can slow someone down, not just the ability to stay focused, but even shifting attention. So getting stuck going from one question to the next. And so there can be a lot, or getting tripped up with, maybe multiple choice questions and having to reread stuff quite a bit. And so there can be a variety of different reasons why someone, even if their processing speed technically is okay, still, the focus becomes an issue and in turn slows them down from completing exams, and then, extended time is important. Again, there's also anxiety and, worries about the time that can make extended time beneficial. On the other hand, there are also times where, some kids with ADHD tend to really speed through stuff and may not really use the extended time, or may get more stressed by knowing they have so much time. It also depends how it's implemented, in the idea that if it's, here's the time you could use, and it's up to them. It's very different than if a child feels, they're being forced to use all the extra time. That may be very uncomfortable to sit there if it's not done. I mean, it's not done as much that way where to sit there for the whole time. But, I've seen some situations in order to sort of help kids ensure they're using the extra time. Sometimes, especially young kids get set up in a way that maybe isn't always ideal.
Right. And I could see it for some kids that have problems initiating tasks. Like, well, I have extra time, so I don't need to start when everybody else starts. Right.
Right. So that creates another issue as well. That's it's why I think each person is different. You have to sort of target any sort of accommodations or supports for each person as an individual, regardless of the diagnosis, and go from there.
Understood. So I know, like, these days ADHD, I've heard from educators also, like, well, anybody can get a diagnosis for ADHD, the Vanderbilt checklist, and the doctors can do it and the schools will do it. But like, why would formal testing with a private psychologist make sense? Like, what more do you get from doing it with you rather than just letting the school do it?
Sure. I mean, that is a good question. I mean, to your point about how, anyone can get a diagnosis, I mean, if you know enough about ADHD, you're, pull a couple things online and you find the right person, someone probably could get a diagnosis, but it doesn't mean it's going to be accurate.
Right.
And with the testing, what I think people don't realize is that, so when you're looking at ADHD, you're looking at a variety of skill sets as part of the testing. So you're looking at someone's cognitive functioning, so their memory abilities, their processing speed, their verbal skills. You're looking at academic functioning, so their reading, writing, math, language abilities. You're also, of course, looking at attention, planning, organizing skills. You're also looking at, mental health stuff in terms of anxiety, depression, OCD. Pretty much, you sort of are almost looking at everything to sort of figure out what's going on. And as part of that, you determine if someone has ADHD or not. So the evaluation really gives you a much clearer picture of, is there ADHD, but also are there other things that maybe are being missed? Like, for example, sometimes, kids may have an underlying, learning disability that maybe no one really thought of, oh, this is an issue because they cover it up very well. But that in looking for ADHD, there may be learning disability or it could be that instead of ADHD sometimes. Or even sometimes, I've seen visual processing issues that sometimes get, misdiagnosed as ADHD at first until someone actually does formal testing and realizes that there is actually a visual issue.
Right.
So there's that. There's also just, you get a lot about how someone functions as a person. Like, I mean, I use the reports quite a bit to tailor, specific study strategies. Because if I know that someone's memory in certain types of areas is quite good, and maybe they have a harder time, let's say, with, other kinds of memory or other skill sets, tailoring study strategies that will likely work well based on how their profile functioning can be really helpful.
Right.
You also, like, I think about testing as sort of like the user guide to your child. Like, it's really just understanding, like, how do, nuts and bolts, how do they function? And it also can be a really great opportunity to really take a sort of a bird's eye view and a detail-oriented approach at the same time towards starting treatment. Instead of throwing a bunch of different sort of services at the child and sort of seeing what works, what doesn't, you have a much clearer sense to be able to, use resources more effectively of what's likely to work based on what the actual issues are.
Right. So the schools just focus on, like, if we're suspecting ADHD, they're just going to do the ADHD assessments. They're not necessarily going to dig into everything else. And I love what you said, because it made me think automatically of, this is the manual that everybody says doesn't come when you have a child, right? Like, that's what a formal assessment is, somewhat, is a manual of how to address certain issues and how your child ticks, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And mine even have a table of contents.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one before. But so you said that it helps because that's where one size doesn't fit all, because that's where you really dig in. And I've seen it way too many times that ADHD is missed or learning disability is mixed because they think, whatever else. Oh, she's just flighty, or he's just too active and isn't paying attention.
Yeah. And like, what I often suggest when people ask me about evaluation is to ask them first, what do you want to get out of the evaluation?
Oh.
Because in that question of, do you go to a pediatrician? Do you, go to someone like me to do the testing, to look at what are you going to do with the evaluation results? I mean, if someone's going into it and all they want is medication and they really don't care about anything else, I mean, obviously, psychiatrists usually do their own informal evaluation. Some will require formal testing by a psychologist, others don't. But, if the only focus is medication, especially if there's not a whole lot else going on, in theory, you could go to, someone just look at medication. but you're not getting as clear a picture. But if you want any sort of other information, in terms of how are they functioning, what else is going on, then, doing a formal testing is, usually the most thorough way to get at that. Right. Because especially with kids, there's so much overlap and stuff. I mean, if someone has a hard time focusing, it could be ADHD, it could be anxiety, it could be depression. There's a lot going on. It's sometimes harder to sort of parcel that out, and without formal testing. Or, I mean, you can ask a lot of questions, but it also depends how well the child can articulate things.
Right. And I always like to say, like, the schools do fine, but they're only looking at the educational part. So, go to private testing because you want the whole picture. You want to see everything that's going on, because it makes a big difference. As you said, like, if somebody's having auditory processing issues or visual processing issues, that's going to be a very different look at how we're going to tweak things for that child to make it, make the general education curriculum accessible, and how to function in society, or not function, but function in society, so how, like, for your coaching, how does that work when it comes to, like, do you always do formal testing, or do you take outside testing? What does that look like?
Sure. I mean, so there's no requirement to have testing, before I do sort of, executive function or ADHD coaching with anyone. Certainly if they have testing, I like to take a look at it. But, a lot of it in the first session is, asking them what's going on, asking the right questions to get the information I want to know to start, and use that to guide. Again, having testing is definitely very helpful, and there are definitely people I do testing for I then work with after. But certainly there are a lot of people that don't have testing, and sometimes I'll refer out for testing once I start working with someone if I see that there's definitely a need for it.
Right. And I would say your knowledge of doing testing helps you do a quick assessment for your potential coaching clients.
Yeah, well, it's funny actually, because my executive functioning bootcamp actually evolved out of doing testing, in that basically I do feedback sessions, and I have a lot of fun with making recommendations for people in terms of, like, I'll look at kids' planners to see how they keep track of assignments and what they use for study tools and things like that, what apps they use on their phone, so that, when I make recommendations, I can make recommendations that are very practical that kids can actually use. And so I would start setting up stuff with kids during the feedback session, and then they'd want to come, this years ago, and then they wanted to kind of keep coming back to work on the stuff. And so that's how sort of the boot camp kind of evolved.
So what is the boot camp? Like, when is it offered?
So basically it's a 2-hour intensive session, usually 1-to-1. I do some small group ones in the summers, but generally the idea is it's a nice way to take a step back, look at what's working, what's not, and how to make improvements or enhancements, with the idea that we look at things like, keeping track of assignments, planning, morning routines, evening routines, like, very practical stuff that a lot of times, like, unless stuff is really not working well, people aren't always going to take the time to take a step back and think about, how could I do this better?
Right.
So the boot camp is a great way both to sort of do that and come away with a written plan of what to do, but also, it opens up that communication, that conversation of, I could do something differently, because I find a lot of it increases self-awareness in kids. And it's just, it's one of the favorite things I get out of it is this sense of, even if kids are super resistant going into it, they usually come out of it in a much better spirit, sort of thinking, oh, this actually is helpful, or it really isn't as hard as I thought it was. I can actually make these changes myself.
Right. And it's also just another set of eyes. Like, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And the kids are plugging along, doing fine, getting decent grades. Okay, we're fine. But all of a sudden you can come in and tweak something that you just saved them an hour a week.
Right, exactly. And then that adds up. And also, one of my big things is I really like to help people learn how to do this stuff for themselves, with the idea of understanding also the principles behind it, not just following some system blindly.
Right. Because, I look back to when I was tutoring, and I was just a teacher, not just a teacher, but I was a teacher and I was tutoring. And all I was doing really was the homework with the kids. And that's what I was basically hired for. But I can see why having that executive functioning coach, you're not just doing homework, you're teaching a child how to be independent, which I know as a parent isn't always easy, because they don't always listen to us as the parent.
Right. I mean, I've often told parents I can pretty much probably say the same thing as them, but because I'm not the parent, the kids may be a little more likely to listen. But right. And again, a lot of it's also the idea of in the moment working on stuff. So, for example, if a child's really anxious because they're having a hard time with the paper, to actually look at the paper and work on getting started and being able to process those feelings in the moment. Because that's one of the other things I think is really helpful about the work, is it's not just the strategies and, here's stuff you set up, you do on your own, but it's also the work you can actually do during the appointments. And again, as a psychologist, I take a different approach, I'm sure, with this than other coaches may who don't have a mental health background, because I can also sort of address the anxiety and other things in the moment. But I think that's also important, because the problem is if you just focus on strategies, you don't really, like, especially if there's OCD or anything else also, you have to look at someone as a whole when you're targeting any sort of interventions.
Right. And the mindset is huge.
Exactly.
The mind is.
Yeah. You look at the motivation, and I mean, the motivation has to be there to some degree in order for stuff to get done.
Right. Like any coach will tell you, it's mindset is, I know my uncle used to say all the time that, like, working out and going to the gym, like 99% of it is just getting there. Because once you're there, you're fine, right?
Right.
So it's
or setting up like your reward system. Like, my big sort of thing with kids is, if we're going to set up a reward system, have it be something that they could technically give to themselves anyway when they're older. I mean, like the workout as an example would be, having a TV show that you watch, but only watch when you're on the elliptical at the gym. So the idea is it motivates you to go because you want to watch that show. Or for kids to say, I get to watch this episode of a show on Netflix I'm watching, but only after I'm done with all my homework.
Right.
Because then they're not relying on the parents to give them a reward for doing something they should be doing anyway.
Right. And one thing I always say is never make it food, because that's the worst, right? Because the reward is food. Then it's like you're all of a sudden eat, like if you're not hungry, but you get the reward of the ice cream sundae,
Right. Yeah. And again, I think, each child's different, and there obviously, if there are other issues, like a sort of eating issue, or in general, you want to be careful of whatever based on, like, or if a kid is, very attached to electronics, it's really hard time self-regulation, being mindful of, giving a lot of extra time as a reward also.
Right. Right. Because and that's a whole nother show.
Right.
Electronics. And because, well, I mean, to touch on a little bit, like, I know, like, in the neurodiverse community, like, some parents are like, it's the only way my kid self-regulates. But then other parents are, my kid is so addicted to it, when I try to take it away, it's just awful. And so it's like that in between of knowing your kid, right?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I find out, and again, it depends obviously on kids and interests, activities, things like that. But to the extent that you can have kids sort of weave in the electronics naturally, like if they have enough activities that, they're reasonably busy, that the electronics time is more of, I have some time left over, let me do this. I find it seems a little bit easier than it being, where electronics is put up on a pedestal and they have all the time in the world. So it's more about restricting it.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Do this, then that. What else? Like, what am I missing? Like, what topics, like, what questions did I miss asking you? Like, what are other things, information we need to get out there?
I would say one of the things that people don't think about that much with ADHD is the hyperactivity and the fidgeting, and the idea that you can actually harness the fidgeting in a controlled way to in turn potentially improve focus a fair amount. Because a lot of times, I mean, not everyone with ADHD has hyperactivity, but if they do, kind of the child who shakes their leg and shakes the table or the desk and makes a lot of noise, or fiddles with stuff and annoys everyone. Like, those are sort of probably some of the common stereotypes with it. But usually those things are mindless, at least initially. But so one of the things I find really helpful with kids is, and adults can use this too, is with doing homework, is to have something like a mindless physical activity they can do while they're doing homework. So for example, like a little, like, they make like these desk bikes or littles about this big, you can pedal on them, and so for some kids that can work really well because they can do it mindlessly while they're doing homework. Because you obviously oftentimes need your hands for homework. So it's a little hard to fiddle with something while you're doing homework unless you're reading. But,
Right.
Doing the desk bike or elliptical, the pedal can be great. If they have like a sit-stand desk, using like a balance board while they're on that can be helpful. You can even use it for kids with, if you have to talk to them about something, you want them to be able to be better focused, have them stand on a balance board while you talk to them about something.
Right.
So just, basically incorporating the movement in can be really huge, huge support. And again, especially younger kids, I mean, I see that being done sometimes in school as an accommodation, but, especially when doing homework and just in general at home, it can be really helpful.
Got it. Because it gets rid of that extra energy so that they can sit still, basically.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, there's countless different kinds of things they can do. I think it's important to sort of be creative with it. And, there's, more of like a rocking board, like kind of something like this.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's, more of like a whirly board like this.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's, the different levels of also how much you have to balance and move with it versus kind of just move a little bit as you feel like it in the moment. Or things like a yoga ball chair or wobble stool can be good as well.
With a wobble seat. I had a wobble seat for my daughter, but she liked putting it under her feet. than doing it, which that's fine, like however it worked for her, because then she could like push her feet back and forth for that extra. And she's not ADHD. Well, wasn't diagnosed. Yeah, I mean, there's such that overlap with autism, anxiety, and ADHD. I find that it's sometimes hard, like which is it truly, right? Even when you dig deeper. But that's a whole nother episode also on, I hate the labels, but we have to use them, right?
Right. So the labels are helpful into some capacity and just a quick snapshot to someone of maybe what to look for. But the idea is everyone presents somewhat differently, even with those labels. Right. And so that's where it comes down to looking at each person as an individual in terms of how to kind of target, supports for them.
Right. Which is where the individualized comes in on the IEP. Because people ask me all the time, like, well, what accommodations would you look for? Would you ask for? And I'm like, well, if I don't know your child's profile, I can't necessarily recommend what would be appropriate for your child. I can give you a list of accommodations that you can ask for, which is basically anything your child needs to be successful, but it's not going to be tailored to your child unless there's actually knowledge of the profile. Because, as you know, like it just doing a task analysis for some kids, other kids don't need that. And then they're just going to get annoyed because that's not what they need. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because I see it just reminds me of like with the planning with kids. That's one of the things I see that there's, initially there's often a sense of resistance of I don't want to do any extra steps.
Right.
And so I think for kids, if it doesn't feel like it's super easy, then they don't want to do it. But I think once they can take a step back, especially like when they, because relying on memory is probably one of the biggest things I see with kids with ADHD, and obviously knows about too, rely on their memory for tasks and don't think about that you're more likely to forget stuff in the moment, or you're not going to, but basically it can reduce stress by seeing it all in front of you, but doing it in a way where it doesn't feel tedious. Because I've also seen some where, kids feel like they have this super rigid system they're given to use, and to them, it just doesn't feel natural. So like trying to find a good system that's natural to them to use can really help.
And that's what you do with them.
Yeah. So a lot of I don't have one method that I use for helping kids keep track of assignments. I mean, there's probably at least like 10 or 15 different ones based on, each person's needs, what they want to do, what makes sense based on the age and, a variety of other factors. And so it's really for each person to figure out what kind of system makes sense. What do they want and going from there. But to the extent possible, it's often better to try to take an existing system and tweak it rather than completely overhauling unless it's absolutely necessary.
Right. Right. And then tweaking it along the way, because I'm sure, elementary school versus middle school versus high school are so different in what you need to do. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And also the idea of how much you write yourself or a kid writes himself to record it versus like automating it. I mean, because with, Canvas or NCPS, you can take the calendar feed page, you can copy the ICS calendar link out of it, and you can basically put all the assignments in whatever program you want as long as it accepts a calendar link.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like you can take, all the assignments from from Canvas, you can put them into Google Calendar, Apple Calendar. So if you want to view them in a calendar format outside, and it syncs up. So basically, so then anything new that will pop up into Google Calendar, as long as as long as you do like the copy to sync, there's like I think an export option where it just does a one-time thing. But as long as you do the normal like syncing, it'll keep syncing every time there's a new assignment added.
Interesting. Now I just need to get access to Canvas because I have parent view, but I can't get into. There's been lots of talk. It's like, why do we need both?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it used to be there's a resources section under parent view where you can click and it opens up like a copy of MySys Classroom or Canvas.
It's supposed to, yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they used to work. I don't know if maybe they deactivated for certain age groups, but.
No, I think it's supposed to. It just something's not clicking right, or could be user error. I'm sure. So I just need one of my friends that are a little more techie than me to talk me through it. But that's good to know it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it also brings up the point that, I think a lot of times there's this perception that with all this technology, it's so much easier for people with ADHD. And in some ways that's true, but the other side, it's also can be more challenging because it just reminded me, for kids in NCPS, for example, having to, log into Canvas to see the assignments and then log into to Student View to see the grades. That it's, right. Multiple steps. Sometimes there's a delay in assignments from Canvas showing up in Student View. And also, I mean, what is actually interesting is with Canvas. So with the Canvas app, there's actually like the to-do list. If you open that up, it's probably the fastest way to see if they're missing assignments because if there's anything on the to-do list prior to today's date, it's there if it's missing. In the like desktop version, you can scroll through like list view or look up a couple other different ways going by class, but it's often more tedious to do it. So I think kids get discouraged and don't always look as carefully if there's stuff that's missing.
Right. And it makes sense. Like, I love the idea, and I'm going to go figure out how to do it with my daughter when I get home, to link the Canvas to her phone, because she's on her phone most of the time. You're not sitting in front of your computer logging into Canvas all the time to say, oh, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? Whereas if she has it linked to her phone, we can set it up that she gets a reminder, 2 days before something is due. And then that way, like, it helps her keep on track of what she needs to do.
Right, exactly. So it's great to, use the apps, and you can also control which notifications you get. So, because, a lot of times I see, kids have, hundreds of notifications from Canvas that go into their school email account, and they never check the email account. And so it just keeps getting flooded. So you can also go in and manually adjust which notifications you get to email, which ones you get to the app. So this way you're getting notifications you want and not as many of the ones that you don't.
Which makes sense, because that's another thing that gets overwhelming. You open your email and there's 50 emails, right. Never mind. I don't need to read any.
Yeah. But I think part of the executive functioning piece, I work a lot besides assignments, is also looking at, we pair that with the idea of checking email regularly. That, I think on some level, there may be a little bit generational, but there's also the aspect that, kids have multiple, even from a young age. I mean, technically, kindergartners and MCPS have email accounts. They may not necessarily check them or use them very much, but they're there. And the idea is that, if you work with kids on this stuff when they're younger, it makes it easier and more natural to check email and get used to it. Whereas if suddenly you introduce it to them when they're in high school, they still can learn to use it. I think it's probably a little bit harder to use as much.
Right. And that makes sense. One of the complaints is that in elementary school, homework's not it's given, but it's not ever collected or graded. And the kids learn that. So that's I don't have to do homework. And then all of a sudden they get to middle school and it's a very different story. And so it's kind of if your family wasn't the one of we do homework, whether it's graded or not, we do homework, then, and you're not in that habit, it's kind of hard to change it when you hit 6th grade, that now all of a sudden, wait a minute, what do you mean I need to do homework? I've never done it.
Yeah, and also in the idea that in elementary school, a lot of times kids get, a weekly sheet, here's the sheet that the teacher sends for the week for homework, and, they're expected to check Canvas in middle school and high school to see the assignments in most cases. Or there's sometimes where teachers will give it in class and it doesn't always end up in Canvas. Right. Initially, and then that creates other issues if you're relying just on Canvas, which is why also working on a way to write stuff down during class is often helpful too.
Yeah, that's the assignment book, to have the backup.
Right.
Because if one's not working, what are you going to do? Right. Then things.
Right. Or having some sort of hybrid system where you have a very simple checklist. You write down whatever you need to at school that is not in Canvas, transfer it to whatever system you're using when you get home. So you have all the stuff planned out with long-term stuff. Because even because of using Google stuff for MCBS is an example, and a lot of school systems also, even using Google Tasks, which you can have open, in the same window as a school email account or a Google Doc, it's probably one of the simplest task list systems to use. That clearly is not blocked because it's built into stuff that, is part of the Google for Education suite.
Right. Yeah. Because that's the email block. That's a whole nother thing, the tech stuff. So people listening, or they're like, oh, that boot camp sounds great, or I need my child tested. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Sure. Just go to my website, hellerpsychologygroup.com. There's a form at the bottom of the page. I think it says click connect. And basically I try to, practice all of the executive function stuff that I work with clients on. So it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you click the button, you fill out a form, and then I'll basically send you a link to the portal with paperwork, and you can schedule a new client call with me or initial appointment and go from there. So it's pretty straightforward and doesn't involve having to play phone tag at all.
Which is nice. That is the biggest plus of technology. Just go onto my calendar and book it. You want to meet? Yeah. Here you go. Or
that definitely saves a lot of time.
Right. How many emails going around or phone tag going around? And it's all of a sudden it's a month later and you still haven't done anything. So this has been so awesome, Carey. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your wisdom with the listeners.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Stress Free IEP. We hope today's conversation gave you new tools, insights, or just a little more peace of mind as you support your neurodivergent child. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode helpful, please share it with someone in your village. You can always learn more and connect with me at schefterlaw.com or follow along on social media. Until next time, remember, you do not have to do it all alone.